Hello, my guest today is Professor Norman Fenton. Norman went from being a pillar of the mathematical establishment to number one outcast and leper during the COVID crisis. And he did this remarkable feat simply by being consistent, holding to his science, his craft, everything he knew to be true about his specialism, which was risk, with particular reference to medical risk. This put him in conflict with the authorities, and he must have lost a lot of friends. He certainly gained a great many new ones, and it's lovely to welcome him here today. Norman, welcome. Thank you very much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Ken.
I'd like to start, if I may, looking at this, going back to the COVID times. It was a very, very strange time. We had essentially the abandonment of reason, the abandonment of judgment, the abandonment of knowledge in many regards. Could you maybe just say a few words about how you were perceiving this as it was all running forward and all of these policy prescriptions were coming forward, and you started to see that the evidence wasn't there, and you started to question what was being done? What was the intellectual environment like? What was the response to you asking the obvious and the correct questions?
Well, it was a hostile response as soon as I started to show that the data was telling a very different story to the mainstream narrative of a deadly virus for which there was a high probability that you would die if you caught it. And I was also seeing from academic colleagues that they were essentially contradicting all of the kind of the supposed liberal progressive ideas that should have been associated with people like that. For example, freedom of choice, lack of no censorship, freedom of expression, etc. And I could see that a lot of my colleagues were actually very enthusiastic about the idea that they could use that COVID, that spring to early summer of 2020, when the main COVID hysteria was in place. They were seeing that as an opportunity for the Great Reset. People say, that's a conspiracy theory. I actually never knew about the Great Reset thing until my colleagues were actually who were the ones who were supporting it, were saying this is the opportunity for it. And of course, I was then found out about Klaus Schwab and the book which he wrote called The Great Reset. And I realized that they seem to be very keen on using the lockdowns as an opportunity, they were saying, to clean up the world. They were saying that this is great for the environment. This is a way, people were saying they were saying a way to combat climate change, for example, because, it was, people weren't driving their cars, there was almost no airplane flights, etc. And this frightened me, because I realized that there's a whole other agenda going on here. And I suspected that people, not just within the governments, were coming together with this idea that this was a good thing, that we could use this for the benefit of good, And so we then went on to the whole Build Back Better stuff. And I was simply showing that the data didn't support any of this stuff. That, we already showed that it was nothing like as deadly. And then we were showing from the kind of let's say late summer of 2020, that the massive increase in number of cases was being caused by essentially a fraudulent test. I mean, the PCR test, it's fraudulent, but the way that the fact that if you were giving it to millions of people who were asymptomatic, who didn't have symptoms, you're going to get a lot of false positives. And we showed that. We showed that both theoretically and empirically. And that was when the hostility against me got even greater, because I realized that there was a push towards the end of 2020 to maintain that narrative in order to say the only way out of this, the only way out of lockdowns and out of COVID is the vaccine. And then, of course, that created a new hysteria, which again, the data was showing to be different. The data we were seeing was clearly not supporting, again, the narrative of a safe and effective vaccine.
Yeah, let me go back to that, because I find that very interesting. The failure of academia, the failure of the intellectuals to stand up for the truth in this regard, I had put down, I suppose, to primarily one of either cowardice, because it's your career and you've got to understand which side your bread is buttered on to reach many of these positions, and therefore they're not going to be pushing back against the authorities, or out and out being purchased. They are funded by the very organisations that they would have to oppose, and therefore they're compromised financially. But what you're saying there is actually more than that.
It's more than
that. They weren't coerced. They wanted to do this. They saw this as part of a wider agenda. Could I maybe ask you just to expand a little on that if you could, because I'm really interested about the nature of the agenda that we're pushing and the sort of response you were seeing.
Yeah, okay. Well, it's interesting because the picture that you had up at the introduction, me, was the picture taken by the BBC when I was the presenter of a documentary back in 2015 called Climate Change by Numbers. And that was a very revealing experience from the perspective of understanding this other agenda that a lot of academics have, because what I discovered from that program was a pure propaganda piece by the BBC. It was a straight, climate change hysteria piece, very, very alarmist, and you weren't allowed to question it, as I actually tried to do, but none of my proposed edits made it into the final cut. But what was interesting is that I discovered during the making of that documentary that many of the leading climate scientists, the academics, were in that, not just because they were being funded to do it. So it's partly the things you said there. That's where the funding was, to promote the climate change alarmists, but actually because these were people who had a political agenda. These were essentially political activists. They're academics. They were political activists, in my view, above being academics. So, for example, when I questioned one of the lines that I had to say in that program, it was all scripted. It was all scripted by consultants who were supposedly the expert academics, right? And there was one particular claim that I had to make, and which was screened, which I was very uncomfortable about. And I asked the academic, it was a senior professor, before the program went out, whether that really was true, because I thought it just didn't seem right. And he said, no, it's it's absolutely fine. It's completely fine. There's no problem about saying that. Well, after the program went out, it was pointed out to me that particular academic had quite recently written a paper where it was very clear that he was saying himself that statement that I was asked to say couldn't possibly be true. So I got on the phone to this guy after the program went out and said, look, you said to me that was okay to say that, but I can see from your own recent research paper here that it isn't. And he said, well, we all have to lie for the greater good. And this sums up that gets to the heart of what a lot of these academics are about. And what I discovered is that the whole manipulation of overly complex and ludicrous models, and bad use of statistics is just as evident in the climate change field as it was in COVID. And in many cases, you've got very, very similar, people actually behind it as well. So there is, and it's why are they into it? Because they are tuned into that narrative of the need for a sort of a new world order. They're unhappy, with the current state of the world, and they're very much into this globalist idea, moving towards just sort of the need for, one world government, the technocracy, these people, they need these experts to be in charge, in control of things, because these are the only people who really understand what needs to be done. And that is what permeates the entire academia. Academia is not what many people think it to be. And it's dominated by these cliques who have these very, very strong left-leaning political agendas.
I think the phrase "lying for the greater good" is one that I'll long remember, because if that does sum up what academia has become. It's the intellectual bodyguard of a set of political ideas that are being pushed by governments of more or less all colours, because I don't see much difference between one government and the next, for a particular agenda. Just before we leave the subject, to what extent were they explicit about what they were trying to achieve here, or was it all done with kind of nods and winks?
I don't know. I mean, it's difficult to tell. I think that they were fairly explicit, because they were, for example, made it explicit that they were not going to favourably review any papers, for example, which challenged the official narrative. So there wasn't even an attempt to identify problems in the papers that would challenge it. They were simply rejected on the basis that their conclusions didn't support, what the World Health Organization was saying and what these other academics were saying. So in that sense, I think it was quite an explicit attempt to push that narrative and exclude all contradictory ideas and evidence against it.
Yeah, and of course that brings us to the next part of the drama, because after we had the lockdown, the social distancing, the masking, and all of the debacle with panic throughout the NHS, which was virtually closed down. People were decanted into care homes. There was a very suspicious spike in deaths then. We came through all of that, and everything was locked down again. And this time it was going to be the vaccine. The vaccine was going to save us. In Pfizer we trust. This was the narrative.
Yeah.
And there was no apparent concern that this novel treatment, this novel shot, had been developed in this record-breaking time. The politicians gave bland assurances of safety, and who was actually looking at the data? I tried to find this out. I mean, fairly long and hard. I was asking questions about where the data was, where the quantitative risk assessments were, how we're assessing the risk of giving the shots to the risk of not giving the shots. And it was a very strange experience, because every branch of government that you would think would know, departments of health, not all the rest of it, all pointed at somebody else. And it eventually came round to MHRA, and they didn't seem to know either, and nobody seemed to have any answers. So we'll get on to what that's actually done to people and the harm that it's done. But in terms of the initial lack of data, and whether the data that was eventually put forward as justification was adequate, or was even straight, or was it fraudulent? What's your view on the data aspects of the case they made for the vaccine?
Well, they didn't. We know they didn't have any long-term safety data when they were releasing the vaccine in the end of 2020. There was no long-term data study, so it should never have been pushed out at that point anyway. But very soon after that, in actual fact, you mentioned the MHRA. I mean, we discovered, of course, 2 or 3 years on, that actually the MHRA was from mid-December 2020 until June of 2021, collecting an enormous amount of data suggesting that the vaccines were not safe. This is just in the UK. I mean, of course, similar things were happening with the sort of the VAERS system in the USA. But the fact that this was MHRA and they were keeping quiet about this, we discovered, for example, that they had a monitoring group, an active monitoring group of about 30,000 volunteers for whom they were obliged to regularly provide updates on any adverse reactions they were getting from the vaccine. And we know, for example, that it was something like 60% of those people, 60% of all those being actively monitored suffered an adverse reaction. But at the same time, they had the yellow card system, which was, of course, not an active system. This is just where people are able to report if they even know about it. Of course, only apparently 1% of the population even knew about the yellow card system. So most people who had adverse reactions weren't reporting them. But despite that, there were an enormous number of reports. So many that they couldn't cope. They had software in place, they couldn't cope. And there were so many that they sent the data on to their so-called specialist risk assessors, who were supposed to determine whether there were, the significance of the safety signals here. And we never got the result of that risk assessment. But what we do know is they essentially closed the whole thing down. They stopped recording. They stopped reporting on this as early as June 2021. I mean, the yellow card system kept going, but their active reporting of it, and in particular with this group that they were actively monitoring, that all stopped. There's been no update of that since June 2021. So they knew this disaster. And of course, all of this time coincides, remember, with the disaster, which was the AstraZeneca vaccine. This was the great British success story. But we knew from as early as February, the first reported fatality, even coroner reported fatality, was as early as February 2021. And it was so bad, and so many of the yellow card reports were being received for that vaccine, because it was the one which initially was given more than Pfizer in the UK. But it was so bad that even before whoever it is was Dame Sarah Gilbert, the so-called owner of the programme, inventor of it, got her standing ovation at Wimbledon in June of 2021. We now know that the vaccine had essentially been removed from circulation, and it was never announced. Even today, they don't admit that they withdrew it from circulation. I mean, my understanding, I knew from my GP, because my wife is one of the people who was injured by that AstraZeneca vaccine, right? And I knew from my GP that it was no longer being offered as of the beginning of June 2021. But we've found out since that it had essentially been withdrawn in May of 2021. And all of this is still not known. They're still essentially denying this. You've still got ministers and prime minister getting up and saying that, yeah, even that vaccine was safe and effective.
And this goes to the intellectual cowardice or corruption at the heart of, well, we have to conclude basically the whole establishment, because what you're describing there is a decision. Someone has looked at the data, someone has made a decision to pull the vaccine, and that decision's been hidden from the British public. And this is, I mean, there's many other examples of this. One of them was the whole safety case. And the response to the yellow card system, because the yellow card system was flashing red from the very start of the vaccination program. Yeah. There was huge numbers of reports that dwarfed everything that had ever happened on the yellow card system. And the response was to trash their own system. So when people were going forward with, well, look at what the yellow card system is saying. The response was, well, anyone can report to the yellow card system. It's passive. We really don't know anything about these people. What can you do? They trashed the data, and they also suggested that it was an overestimate, which we know to be the very reverse. And they always, up until that point, themselves claimed to be the very reverse of the case. They said we might get 10% of serious cases,
exactly
1% of all the cases. This is the sort of reporting levels that they were expecting. And all of a sudden, it was an overestimate because it suited the narrative.
Yeah.
And then when people said, okay, MHRA, you're responsible for vaccine safety. How do you know it's safe? The first words out of their mouths were, oh, well, we've got the yellow card system. And the contradiction in these positions, they just didn't seem to care about. Now, this takes us to the smoking intel. There must be information on file. There must be decisions, there must be emails, there must be letters, there must be meetings where somewhere the reality must have been considered. Because if it wasn't considered, they wouldn't have pulled the vaccine, right? There was a decision, so there must have been a decision maker somewhere.
Yeah.
And that's invisible as far as I can see at the moment. We've got ongoing COVID inquiries, and none of those questions are being asked.
No.
What do you make of the inquiry process and the search for truth and really the kind of ongoing importance of finding out what was actually done to us in 2021?
I think the inquiry is a complete whitewash, and I think that the hard questions and answers to those questions that you're implying there are not going to come out for another 20 years. In 20 years' time, we will find out about the actual discussions, about the actual memos which led to some of these decisions, but it won't come out until then. It's going to be a complete whitewash. I mean, the fact that you've got, a lot of the inquiry was actually focusing on the notion that we should have locked down harder and faster and sooner. Yes. I mean, that just shows you the nonsensical level that we're at. And
nobody laughed. This was the thing. They would say to the politicians, wise politician, have you any regrets about this terrible COVID crisis we've all been through? And the politician would look sad and say, I wish I'd locked down harder and sooner, and we'd done more, and we paid less attention to these whining civil liberties types, right? Yeah. And nobody giggled, nobody laughed, nobody said, you're not on sunshine. I take it you've not had any invites to any of these to talk about the statistical aspects.
No, I certainly haven't. I mean, the only invites I get are from Andrew Bridgen to to his event.
Well, that will make sure you don't get any invites from anybody else. So they ran out the vaccine program. They ran it out against the VAERS system, the yellow card system, all screaming there was a problem, and more people saying there's a problem. And at the time, I worked for UK Column, we were getting taken off YouTube and banned from places for speaking accurately about vaccine damage, right? And we were only scratching the surface, and the level of censorship of that story was something to behold. I remember getting thrown off Twitter within maybe 15, 20 seconds of putting a tweet out, and the tweet was official government statistics on vaccine harm. Yeah, it was essentially raw data, and making the point that this is what the statistics say. And I was gone. I was out of there. Yeah. Twitter jail. So the focus across the media, and presumably across academia as well, was on silencing the vaccine injured.
Yep.
Which is a shocking thing, because how many more vaccine injured people did we have simply because of that policy? Or how much worse were they? Because people were going along to hospital with a serious adverse vaccine reaction, and they were given paracetamol and told to go home.
Yeah, no, I mean, just take the example of John Watt. I mean, he's the guy who challenged Rishi Sunak in public the other day in that debate. Of course, I know him well from, I've interviewed him before and know all about his story. But his story is very interesting, right? Because he took the vaccine when he was injured by the vaccine quite late. I think his was like, it wasn't like some of these others we were talking about early in 2021. He didn't take it, he's quite young, until I think it was about a year later. Right, that's when he got injured. Now, there were many of us who were silenced, who'd been screaming about the problems of the vaccine and all of these issues that we discussed long before that, but we were censored. And he said, if only he had heard, he wasn't aware. The censorship was such that he was completely unaware of the kind of stuff that we were doing and people like me were doing and saying. And had he been aware of it, he would never have taken the vaccine.
And this is where the policies of organisations like the BBC, and the same applies, it's less dramatic, but it's still very serious, the same applies to the climate change policy, where they have decided that there is no other opinion. And that if anyone comes up with one, it will be censored, it will be silenced. You will not have dissenting opinion allowed on the BBC. There was certainly a very thorough scrubbing of dissenting opinion from the BBC over the vaccine injury. They've not been able to hold that line now, but during the time when the vaccines were being rolled out, they certainly did, and they silenced it, and people would have known, and indeed the medical profession would have known, and maybe even would have gone and done something like informed consent. So this was rolled out against this wall of misinformation and propaganda and censorship and suppression of the truth and suppression of the stories of the people who have been harmed most reprehensibly of all. And what we've ended up with is a worldwide elevating of the death rate. And the death rate in the part of the population where you would normally expect the death rate to be low. Healthy, young people, middle-aged people without any serious health challenges. Sometimes sportswomen are dropping dead or are suffering serious health effects. And it's showing up across the world, again, in the statistics, in the all-cause mortality rates, in what's termed excess death. Could you tell us what you're seeing from the statistics in that area?
Yeah, this is where I don't buy into the massive increase in all-cause death that has been claimed by some of the people who were challenging the narrative. So, I mean, I think you sent me a link to look at the paper of Dennis Rancourt and his colleagues, which had claimed something like 17 or 18 million deaths directly caused by the vaccine worldwide. I'm fully aware of that work. I think there has been an increase in all-cause mortality in those in the most vaccinated countries. We are seeing that. How much of that, the scale of that, and how much of it is directly caused by the vaccine is unclear. I would not put a figure like 17 million. I did an analysis of the UK data, and I felt up until when I did it, which was I think September of 2023. At that point, I put an estimate of something like 16,000 deaths, which I think have been caused by the vaccine in the UK. So it's nothing like, it's not in the hundreds of thousands or anything like that. I think that there would be an increasing number of indirect deaths caused by the vaccine due to things like the turbo cancers that we're now seeing. But I don't think we're seeing the enormous numbers that have been claimed by some. So I'm a little bit skeptical of those, of those kind of like depopulation level claims of excess deaths. And I also think that there's some quite complex modelling in that work, which I don't fully understand. And there's also the issue of how you measure. I'm a little bit sceptical of the of how you measure excess death because of the different ways. It can be done very, very different ways. So different countries, different data collection organizations measure excess deaths in very different ways. It not only depends on which years you take as the stable baseline, right? That's critical. Do you include, for example, how far do you go back? Do you include 2020? Do you include 2021 and 2022, which were kind of like potentially COVID or confounded years? All of those issues can radically change whether you've got excess deaths or non-excess deaths. So, for example, there was a big debate about, so New Zealand, for example, I was quite surprised that very, very small differences in the way you consider the baseline, also the way you actually model and calibrate for changes in demographics over the years when you're computing the baseline. All of this stuff, it's very, very complex to do properly. There doesn't seem to be any universally agreed way. And it turns out that it's very, very sensitive to small changes there. So you can get quite big shifts in whether you've got significant or excess deaths or not based on those definitions. So for all those reasons, I'm uncomfortable about making those grand claims about excess deaths. But I think we saw it all. We looked at the UK data, and we saw very early on that there was a small peak in all-cause mortality when the peak vaccine rollouts were happening. And irrespective of all the claims that have been made about what that was all about, there is the only rational explanation for such a coincident peak. It wasn't massive, but it was coincident. It was people dying relatively shortly after the vaccination. So we saw that, and we also saw, even with the ONS data, which was compromised in all kinds of ways, it was systematically biased towards attempting to show that the vaccinated were getting better outcomes, and they were even claiming lower all-cause mortality. But as soon as you adjusted for the biases, we saw this wasn't the case. But what we actually saw in their most recent data that they were producing reasonably regularly this mortality by vaccination status data. And towards the end, even with their bias, even without taking account of the biases, even not doing any adjustments, you were seeing that in most age groups, the all-cause mortality in the ever vaccinated, was a bit higher than that of the never vaccinated, even without all their biases. And what happened? They've stopped reporting. They say they no longer need to report the mortality via vaccination status data, because we know the vaccines have done their job and they've saved all these lives, so we don't need to collect that data anymore.
Yeah.
Ridiculous. Yeah.
It is ridiculous. And this takes us again back to the nature of the work that's being done, the nature of modelling. I mean, the modelling was a huge driver of this. The predictive modelling was a huge driver in the early days of the policy, and was used, it would appear, to persuade any politicians who might have been reluctant to completely trash the country, its economy, and its constitution, feeling that might be a bad political move, perhaps, and career-ending. To persuade them that, they better comply, right? Because this is cataclysmically bad. This is what's coming down the line. Yeah. Right. So it was to put fear into decision makers as well. And this was done on the basis of mathematical modelling of extremely dubious type. And the fact that it should be done on mathematical modelling at all was itself troubling, right? Because this takes us to Alfred North Whitehead and his fallacy of misplaced concreteness, the mistake of confusing a mathematical model with the reality it's meant to be modelling. people become fixated with the models and they stop questioning whether it actually means anything or whether it means what they think it means. What does it mean in reality? And that fundamental understanding seems to be lacking, certainly in the political class, because I didn't see any sign of the modelers of the people pushing this narrative being held to account with any sort of checks and balances. There were none. All the safeguards seem to have failed us.
And look at who the modelers were. Again, it comes back to this academic clique, this elite who dominate the funding bodies, who have that particular political activist agenda that I mentioned earlier. It's the same people. These were the people, the government. I mean, to be fair, let's put it blunt. We had a conservative government which was relying on hardcore leftists, many of whom were Marxists, to basically determine the future policy of the UK over this, not realizing that those people were always going to use that kind of opportunity to implement their own ideas for a new kind of society. It's not just the mathematical modelers, right? We've got to remember that who was the person, I guess, in charge of the sort of the behavioral insights stuff, the nudge stuff. You had the communist Susan Mickey.
Yes.
So she was the one responsible for effectively for Project Fear, for actually saying that she recognized that people weren't sufficiently motivated to want to lock down hard and to do all the things that they were claiming needed to be done to avoid this crisis. And so she used her behavioral psychology skills to basically create this campaign of propaganda, of fear, which did turn the tide. So you had this situation whereby a communist, a card-carrying communist, was creating that policy for a conservative government, and they never questioned the potential political narrative or motivation behind that. They just assumed that I think that there's a lot of naivety. I think that the politicians naively believe that all of these modelers, the mathematical modelers and these behavioral scientists and all of these people who were advising them, who incidentally are all picked by each other. The reason why people like me who are sort of contrarians never get a look in, because they know that we're not going to abide by it. We don't buy into their philosophy. These are all people who basically think the same. It's an echo chamber. And all of the academics, all of the people on Sage, all of the people on independent Sage, many of them were the same, have this same way of thinking. And the politicians are sufficiently dumb. They didn't realise that this was effectively a counter. It's like a counterinsurgency which they created and allowed to happen themselves.
And this is puzzling to me, right? Because okay, the politicians, they're mostly lawyers, so they don't understand much about mathematics and risk. Okay. And they don't understand much about medicine. Okay. But surely they understand politics, right? What else are they for? If they don't understand that someone who is a card-carrying communist is going to see statist solutions that reduce liberty as the answer, and that mindset is going to affect the professional judgment. If they don't know enough about politics and about human beings to realise that, it stretches credulity to think that's naivety, because that just seems to be an incredible position for an experienced politician to take.
It does. It's incredible to me, and I warned people about this, but just nobody seems to care. I mean, you've now got the situation, of course. What's Susan Mickey doing now? She's now head of the behavioural insights team at the World Health Organization, and we've now got, of course, new regulations which are going to make us subservient to those people. So she'll be able to apply her scare tactics next time round on the whole world without any opposition.
So this has been a really good, quick trot through the nature of the problem. Um, as we sit today, I think quite a number of people have woken up to the nature of the problem. Quite a lot of people are much more aware of the political drivers, the worldview, the Marxist, cultural Marxist worldview of the people who are driving these agendas, and of the nature of the agenda, and the fact that at the core, it's elitist, it's very anti-life, and it's certainly not about them operating in our interests. Right? That's not what's on the agenda. So a lot of people are waking up, and a lot of people, I think, now are pushing back. Now, my interaction with academia is limited. What I've seen, I have seen people pushing back. There's been quite a lot of cases that have come to employment tribunals where people have been dismissed for saying things that not only is it their genuine belief, but if you go back 10 years, it was everyone's genuine belief, right? It was completely normal for the entire history of mankind until 10 minutes ago, and now they're being hounded out of the jobs for believing that men are men and women are women, for example. Now, there's been some victories in the employment tribunals. I know some people are pushing back, some brave individuals are pushing back on this, but I know it's an uphill struggle because academia is controlled to such an extent by this cultural Marxist worldview, by the far left worldview, and by the big state, internationalist, anti-nation, and in many regards anti-life agenda that comes with it. Do you see some signs for at least a little bit of hope? Is there some fight back coming? Is there some pushback? Are academics finding more space to speak out?
No, I haven't seen any evidence of it. I see. I mean, of course, I wouldn't say I was forced out of academia at the end of 2022, but since I wasn't getting the institutional support to push back against the all of the attacks that were coming against me, attempts to not just censor me, but to actually accuse me of being, misinformation merchant, accuse me of all kinds of ridiculous things, which there was absolutely no basis, and the lack of support for that. I felt, in the end, I had to go. There were other reasons, but that was a major one. I'm still emeritus professor at Queen Mary University of London, and I'm still very much in touch with obviously not just what goes on there, but with other academics, other academic colleagues everywhere. And what I'm seeing is, if anything, there's a doubling down on that. The whole DEI thing, the diversity, equity, inclusion thing is being ramped up ever more. So where that is essentially that is the as you use the term, the cultural Marxism. I mean, that is cultural Marxism. That's what it is. You're seeing again the things like the critical race theory, rather than being ridiculed as it should be, we're seeing more of that stuff coming in, and if anything, I think we're seeing more self-censorship of those of that very, very small number of academics who reject the cultural Marxist agenda.
In that case, then, is the threat going to be against competence? If we're hiring people because of things which are irrelevant to competence, if the competent people feel they cannot speak out and are hiding, are we looking at increasing calamities, not necessarily because of a political worldview driving it, not necessarily because of money interest driving it, but just due to a lack of competence in important positions?
Oh, of course. I mean, that's been happening. It's been happening for years, and it's going to get worse. People have no idea how overrated academia, universities are, and how incompetent so many supposedly esteemed professors are. I mean, just look at the case last week. I mean, I don't know if you've been following the Mark Stein case on his the defamation case, which was brought against him by the climate scientist Michael Mann. I mean, to look at that guy who is considered to be in his own as one of his supporters on Twitter, I said yesterday, which he loved, said, "You're the Paul McCartney of climate science." Okay, so it's this. If that guy is the star of climate science, right? You just have to look at that guy's work and look at the way that guy behaves to realize what a catastrophic state that so-called climate science is in. And unfortunately, those types of cliques and that type of incompetence is there in many different areas of science, as we saw with, and it applies to areas of epidemiology and clinical medicine, and as well as even mathematics and statistics and probability, and even in things like artificial intelligence, and data science. That is an area which is also massively dominated by people who have that sort of cultural Marxist perspective, and those are the people who've been promoted into the positions of power, not just professorially, but also on the people who make the decisions, the big funding decisions as well.
It's been a real pleasure to listen to you today, Norman. It always is. But I think you've been really informative, and it's been a tremendous review of where we're at. And it's a very difficult position that we find ourselves in a world that's just falling intellectually to error and to, in many places, evil, certainly to lies. So I want to thank you for your time, for all you do to push back against lies, and would just offer you, do you have any final words before you go?
No, just you keep on with your good work as well, David.
I certainly will, Norman. Thank you very much, and until next time, goodbye.
Bye.